But the war economy, the destructive economy that we live under prevails. We have designed this economy by default in order to protect ourselves, which means in order to make war. We live under a war-based economy, and we see evidence of it all around the world. We're seeing rather dramatic evidence of it now, of course, in Eastern Europe.
And welcome once again to the Climate Emergency Forum. My name, once again, is Regina Valdez, and I'm joined for the first time in a long time by my co-anchor here, Fat Tony, affectionately known as simply Tony. So he'll be helping out with the narration, and he's going to be our fact checker for today. But without further ado, today we'll be speaking to the economics of destruction. I wanted to let you in on a little secret, and that is society is going to collapse in 2040, sometime thereabout. And yeah, you heard it right, 2040, society will collapse. So if you haven't heard yet, in 1972, researchers at MIT published a book, and it was called The Limits to Growth. And this study predicted that society would collapse by 2040. But I'm going to let you in on another little secret, and that is Gaya Herrington. She is a sustainability analyst, and she also works for the accounting giant KPMG. So she's really key to our understanding today. And what she had to add to that MIT study is that we're actually ahead of schedule. So I just wanted to look at some of the reasons that societies throughout the history of humanity have collapsed. And these are generally categorized into 4 sections, and they are political issues, social and cultural issues, environmental issues, and economic issues. And the study Limits to Growth, which was based on this computer program, it was called World 3. And this program had information fed into it, and it looked at so many different scenarios. It looked at exponential economic and population growth and judged that in concert with the Earth's finite resources. And they looked at the interaction between the Earth systems and human systems. So we are a system. And basically what they looked at was that whenever you change something over here, it's going to change something over here, because you can't change something in a vacuum. Everything interacts together. We are truly a web of existence. And so the main conclusions were that if growth continues, and that means world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion, if it continues, the limits to the growth will be reached within the next 100 years, and they pinpointed that to around 2040. And that the most probable result, and this was scary, would be a sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. Now, when you're saying, wow, a sudden decline in population, do people stop having babies? Maybe. Hey, maybe there's just birth control all throughout the world, or maybe even worse, there's tremendous scarcity of food. People die in multiple famines. So they also came to the conclusion that it's possible to alter these growth trends and have ecological and economic stability that would be sustainable. And that if we did strive as people around the world to reach this outcome, we'll have a chance for success into the future. But if not, then this societal collapse is all but inevitable. I want to remind you of Gaya Herrington. She says that we are ahead of the curve. And I also want to bring to mind that the study in 1972 didn't have all of the climate information that we have now. So yes, things are worse. She says, Herrington, that the greenhouse gas emissions, they're a shared existential challenge. So she also states that population is not the big scare that it was, but it's pollution. And I want to add, she says that there's nothing inevitable about these predictions. We can change. It's not inevitable. And I want to pass it over to Peter and see if he has any thoughts about the fact that these dire predictions are not inevitable. Do you go for this, Peter? Do you believe that?
Well, how dire is dire? Yeah, that's a very important study. I remember very well when Limits to Growth came out, and it was the first sort of multiple exercise on modeling. And it's amazing actually how accurate it was. Gaya Herrington, one of the first things she said was that it's really interesting that, you know, the worst case scenario that they did several scenarios, is coming to pass. And in particular, as Regina mentioned, and very, very alarming, her remodeling in which she introduced some aspect of greenhouse gases, food production, passes pretty well passes a tipping point at 2040 and on. So there's a very, very powerful message there. So I want to address a question which has long been dear to me, because I sort of started in my activism career, part-time activism and full-time doctoring, with a lot of young people my age in trying to get some sense out of the governments and leaders who were making bigger and bigger and more atom bombs and hydrogen bombs. And in those days, we were literally scared that this madness, it was called mutually assured destruction, a policy in which if both sides, US and USSR, kept on increasing their weapons so that they were about balanced, that was the best way to have peace. And people really believed this was the best way to have peace. But in retrospect now, we nearly blew the world up several times. So my question would be, and particularly at this time, is there an economics of peace? Well, indeed there is. If you Google, you'll find journals, papers published on economics of peace. It's a real thing. Although, you know, unfortunately, if you know the old question, if somebody asks you, well, what do you want in the world most? And you say, well, peace, well, they'll laugh at you. Because we've lived through generations and generations of most horrible warfare. And so it seems to be impossible to create a world of peace, but that is absolutely untrue. We've got societies and cultures of peace going way, way, way back. But what we do have to do is we have to learn about it. Like everything else, in order to create a peaceful world, we have to understand how to do it. And we're not doing this at all, really. Although there are proposals for departments of peace in governments, as well as departments of defense, which of course are departments of war. And in actual fact, the first time this was recommended was in the United States in the late 1700s. And a writer there came up with, why don't we make departments of peace in this country? So there's been some progress. The UK has tried, Germany has tried, but the war economy, the destructive economy that we live under prevails. We have designed this economy by default in order to protect ourselves, which means in order to make war. We live under a war-based economy, and we see evidence of it all around the world. We're seeing rather dramatic evidence of it now, of course, in Eastern Europe. But there's nothing surprising about all this, because this is how our economy is. It is for making war between ourselves, for killing ourselves with these horrendous weapons, which should not exist at all. And my final thing is I want to mention a book. I want to mention a book that was a big seller in 1973 by Fritz Schumacher called Small is Beautiful. It is time to read this book. I reread it recently. It's a wonderful book. It's called Economics of Buddhism, and economics as if people mattered. So we really need to, as well as keep up our emergency warning, we need to also work towards developing an economics of peace.
Thank you so much, Peter. You know, I like so much what you had to share, and we have this emphasis. You're so right. I mean, if we look at some of the top war colleges in the United States, they easily come to mind. West Point, Annapolis. We spend so much money shoring up these academies. But you're so right. Where are our peace colleges? Where are they? We need that. Where are the options for, in my country, in the United States, I mean, young people do have the option of joining the military if they don't want to go to college. Of course, young people can join the Peace Corps, but the Peace Corps often is in concert with university experience. So we need more opportunities for people to engage in these peaceful endeavors. I'm wondering, Paul, what your thoughts are on this whole matter.
Yes, thank you, Regina and Peter. So I often say that, people ask me if I was in charge of, say, US government, what would I do to address climate change? And I often say that I would take the US military budget, which is, 600, 700 billion per year. And, the companies and the engineers and scientists that are working for these companies building arms, and I would redirect them to use their know-how and knowledge and to develop technologies to greatly accelerate the required transition to renewable energies powering our society, to basically retool our society on like a war footing, and also to research and develop and deploy technologies, if at all possible, to cool the planet, remove CO2 from the atmosphere, remove methane from the atmosphere, to try to restore a healthy planet that was enjoyed by our grandparents, so that our children, when they get older, they come into a world that is inhabitable, a world where there's hope for them to pursue careers, etc. Not a world that is like teetering or on the edge or of collapse. And often climate change problem is referred to as a tragedy of the commons, is the term that the economists use. The burning of fossil fuels is the best example of tragedy of the commons, because the emissions are going up into the air and the water, the oceans that we all rely on to support life on this planet. And there's no cost in the economic system to account for these so-called externalities, which is another phrase that the economists all use. And even waste going into landfills, the pollution of the atmosphere and oceans. And we've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere and the oceans in terms of how they respond to heat. And, these are all things that aren't given a price tag. And we're acting like there's no value to human life in the future, essentially. Economists, when they work out their models, a key parameter in their models is what value do we give a child that is, say, born in 50 years or 100 years? Do they have equal value to a child that's living today? Do they have no value? Do they have a discounted value? And what value do we give to plants and animal species on this planet? Like, they're not in the equation either. We just use plants and animals to human near-term advantage, and yet we're getting tremendous loss of biodiversity, populations plummeting of all species, numbers of different species plummeting because of greatly higher extinction rates and so on. If you look at the power structures in society, the richest and most powerful companies are the large oil companies and also the military industrial complex. We've perfected warfare, perfected in terms of from a purely cold viewpoint of most efficiency in killing the so-called enemy. War is basically organized murder, and we happen to be filming this video on the second day of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and this is a good sort of example. I see these sort of things as cascading stressors on civilization, on democracy, on economic systems. And in fact, you put it nicely, Regina, by talking about the four sort of things that are looked at: the political, social and culture, environmental issues, and economic. So these are all entering into play. So for example, Russia, who's attacking Ukraine, is a petrostate. 60% of their exports are fossil fuels. The Ukraine has lots of resources that Russia would like to control. The Ukraine has traditionally been called the breadbasket of Europe. When it was part of the Soviet Union, it was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Financial Times just published a report yesterday, in fact, and they said that 1/3 of the global wheat exports are from combined Russia, Ukraine, 1/5 of global corn exports, 80% of sunflower oil. Of course, the natural gas exports from Russia heat Europe, and natural gas also goes into making fertilizer, which is important to get high yields of food supply. So it's all connected. Our economic systems are very fragile, and they're being forever hammered by abrupt climate system change. Is the root stressor.
Yeah, I really like the whole notion of the fragility of these systems. I mean, we really have to care. And the thing is if we don't care, how easily, and remember at the top of the show, I said, we are a system, humanity. And if we don't care for the fragility of these systems, well, that means we just don't care for ourselves, for others. It's a bleak commentary on humanity. And war, as we all know, is one of the worst things for the environment. I can't imagine, we do understand that people are dying with bombing. Other living beings besides humans, or shall I say in addition to humans, die as well. So it's just this devil may care attitude. Just that the war machine is just so frightening. But I love this idea of taking the best and the brightest minds, which I agree are wholly occupied with shoring up the military industrial complex, taking them from focusing on ideas of destruction and paying them to come up with salvation of this planet and the remaining living beings on it. What a concept. But it is just, it's lunacy that the best and the brightest minds are diverted towards destruction. Do we have to wait until we're at the precipice of extinction before we make a change? I do wonder that. I do wonder if that is the case. And Peter, do you think that we can come to our senses before then?
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious to all of us that we've really got no choice, but things just go on. And I must say, I really enjoyed listening to both of you address this, and very much enjoyed, Paul, what you had to say. You touched on all the things which are really, really, really important. I just want to stress then that sustainability and peace and looking after the planet and getting rid of climate change, they all go together. It's one whole thing. Paul and you both explained that we're not going to even begin to deal with the climate emergency, and we haven't started to begin to deal with it unless we change ourselves, the way we look at things and think about things, as Regina explained, and unless we change our economics completely. And we have what have been called alternative economics. We have ecological economics, we have an international society of ecological economics, and that largely came out of the book that I referred to. So I just want to tell you a little story about the book. So Fritz Schumacher, who at the time I can remember, his book resulted in being called one of the most important 100 books and authors of the time. He was highly, highly respected. Everybody bought his book. And what's interesting is he was a traditional extractive economist. He was German descent and trained in England. And he was sent to Burma to tell Burma how to develop their economics. And it had a big effect on him because he saw that the Buddhism combined with the traditional animistic religion of Burma produced a very good, happy, sustainable society. So he was very much affected by this, made a complete transformation, wrote his book, pretending he was comparing the economics that we have then and today, which is an extractive, unsustainable, destructive economics. And he pointed out destructive of the human spirit, destructive of humanity, and destructive about how we enjoy our life and enjoy with other people. And so he wrote the book pretending that there was a Buddhist economics compared to the economics which we have, which is inherently destructive. And it made a great impression on people.
Thank you, Peter. I'm reminded, I'm not going to say it verbatim, but I'm reminded by a quote from Albert Einstein. If there is a religion that is to save humanity, it would be Buddhism. And I don't make it a secret. I'm a Buddhist, so I'm going to concur with what he said. But, you know, one of the primary tenets of Buddhism, and this goes back to the top of the show as well, is the whole notion of interconnectedness. You cannot affect one living organism without affecting another. Nothing occurs in isolation. And that's so critical to understanding the science of climate change. As the carbon dioxide goes up, heating goes up. As water falls less in the West, fires are increase. So when this happens, that happens. That's what we say. That's our English translation in Buddhism. When this happens, that happens. It's as easy as can be, but it's incredibly, incredibly profound. And I do agree, this whole notion of human happiness has a profound effect on economics. When we're happy, we don't have this hedonic urge to continually consume. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Paul.
Yes, and thank you. Thanks again, Regina and Peter. So economics has really failed us in many ways in terms of the levers and the incentives for keeping a healthy planet. You know, we talked about the tragedy of the commons. Economics tends to put a value on things, and if things don't have a value, then they're just ignored in all of the models. So people have looked at putting a value on trees, like on forests, on rivers, fish, fresh water, clean atmosphere, and you know, they haven't really gotten a handle on doing that. They assume that everything comes down to supply and demand, and you know, is price driven. You know, when things become much scarcer, the price goes way up, so the usage goes down, and therefore you never run out of resources. They assume basically an unlimited capability of the earth to provide materials and you know, food and water to sustain humanity. And clearly we've run into all kinds of different limits, both physical limits and limits to all of these different parameters, which are studied greatly at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And as far as the military and war is concerned, the military is given a free pass in terms of their fossil fuel emissions. So the military in peacetime actually consumes a very, very large amount of fossil fuels to run their equipment and keep their training up, etc. And then, of course, wartime is just catastrophic to the environment. Think of the emissions that go up into the atmosphere. Think of the buildings that are completely leveled and destroyed. So any rebuilding efforts consume huge amounts of materials, and let alone the people's lives that are shattered and disrupted and making them much less able to be productive citizens of society. There's a lot of trauma and emotional hardships that people never fully recover from. So there's all of these interconnections, as you say, and in climate, we talk about the cascading feedbacks, but there's all kinds of different cascading effects in economic systems. And, we often don't realize how fragile our society is. Generally, collapse doesn't happen all at once, although we think it does, right? But generally, there's precipitating events. So I call it death by 1,000 cuts, and different countries around the world have different levels of resilience in all of those four areas: political, social and culture, environmental and economic. So each country has different factors that they're weaker and stronger in. So collapse happens sort of slowly at first and builds up. Eventually there's exponential change, and then basically we're in a different world. So that's how the collapse sort of happens. So it's it's all interconnected for sure. No question.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Paul and Peter. I think, well, we came here to speak about economics, and we did, but we also spoke about the importance of interconnectedness, interconnectivity, interdependence, if you will. And, talking about societal collapse is kind of heavy, isn't it? But I want to close on a positive note. And this is a quote from Noam Chomsky. He says that optimism is a strategy for making a better future. Because unless you believe that the future can be better, you are unlikely to step up and take responsibility for making it so. And even though we can sometimes talk about grim things here, we do that because we really want to enlighten and inform, so that the more people know, the more they can take the helm in doing whatever they can to make the future better. So if you did learn something from this show, go ahead and give us a like. That helps us with the YouTube analytics. Share it with a friend. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. We'd love to add you to our numbers, to our family. And we're going to put links in the description to the books and the studies that were mentioned in this video. And if you have any thoughts on things that we didn't discuss, ideas that we missed, or future shows, please leave those in the comments as well. We do read them. So thank you all very much. And remember, optimism is the answer. Thank you all very much and have a great day.